And welcome to Podcastina.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing the show. Can we start with a brief explanation of what it is you do?
Yeah, the crux is I teach sex ed. I either teach teenagers, parents, people, couples, and coach them through things, or I'm teaching the teachers, equipping more people of a variety of backgrounds, different kinds of careers, anybody ultimately that has influence and is a community member in some way, teaching them how to have some of these conversations that feel stressful and maybe even are ones that some folks are trying to avoid because they don't really know what to say or they don't really fully know the answer to whatever question might be coming their way. And so I also work with them, including, teaching a lot of clinicians and therapists about subject matter that isn't always a part of their training. So it's really, sexuality, teaching, storytelling in some ways, essentially like my whole world.
Sexuality is such a profoundly human experience. Obviously, none of us would even be here if it wasn't for sex. And I'm curious, what got you into this line of work?
Yeah, well, I was one of those kids that just really liked to learn about all the things, and especially if the adults and authority figures in my life seemed to try to prevent me from learning or understanding something, I was sort of like, okay, well, that's my new special interest. And this was pre-internet because I'm a dinosaur, but I would spend as much time as I could at the library in the small town that I grew up in, and just trying to sneakily, stealthily access any book about sex or sexuality or whatever topic was available to try to better understand it, because none of the people in my world was certainly going to tell me a damn thing about it. And so that curiosity just always existed. And I went to journalism school, and my assumption was that I would do some sort of fashion journalism or something ridiculous, because I didn't know at the time that there was a way to report and research about human sexuality until I was out of journalism school and needed a job. And I got hired at a magazine that covered the business of adult. And at the time, it mostly covered the business of porn production and porn sales. This was when DVD still was very much like king. Streaming was just on the horizon. And at that point, I just got to really see how the industry itself around creating fantasy content for folks worked on top of my existing curiosity and just constant knowledge building about things like what draws people to certain subjects, what is pleasure, what is arousal, how do our bodies exist and work, how do they shift and change, what I don't know, what happens in our brains when we're seeing something that we think is really fun or we're having a human experience, like what's lighting up, what's not. And then always with a through line of what are the pieces of information that they're not telling us? What's being left out because it's considered an outlier? Or what's being left out because it doesn't support the narrative that makes it feel very easy and digestible? Or what is the stuff that's being left out that complicates the really cute, neat, and tidy clickbait headline? And so over time, that was really what I was focusing the most on, because there was so much that people were leaving out very much on purpose or reframing in really dishonest ways in order to support a very particular kind of story or narrative that felt safe and accessible for people. And to me, it's sort of like, wait a damn minute. Obviously, we know we've always been lied to, but we're kind of getting lied to a whole lot more than you would even think, in ways that sort of what is the end goal here? And how is this really helping anybody? My career just kind of evolved in that direction. And when I stopped doing the journalism, writing, research side, or taking the research and trying to kind of make it make sense to the rest of us, the regular people, I started getting called a sex educator by a lot of people. I was being invited onto podcasts and interviewed a lot. And so to me, I was like, I am technically, yes, I'm educating, but there's something about being a sex educator that requires some facilitation skills and probably a whole lot more to know that I don't currently know about. And so that led me in a more formal sex education training direction, which I think started around 2014. And it's just kind of grown from there.
Well, what a wonderful kind of whirlwind of experiences to lead you down this road. And I would imagine that having a journalism background helps to inform the way that you're delivering the education.
Yeah, it's so useful. I mean, this was in the olden days when blogs were a brand new concept and a little bit of a threat to the journalism industry. And I remember learning very traditional inverted pyramid type reporting styles where you think of an upside down triangle, and at the very top you really want that first paragraph of whatever you're being told to write to try to, as maybe concisely as possible, summarize the thing, because we have to assume that a good chunk of people will like read that and not necessarily the rest. And so as you get to that like point of the upside down triangle, that's where like potentially the less important or less relevant details can go. They can live at the bottom. But that first chunk is really where you kind of need to give like the real meat and potatoes of the information. And I have found it was a total accident. Like I didn't even realize that I was just doing it. I think my brain is just kind of developed in this way. When I explain stuff or when I'm making content online, I'm doing like a verbal inverted pyramid in a lot of ways, because in my mind, at the end of the day, you never know if anyone's going to watch to the end of that 90 seconds, because we're all busy and have no attention spans anymore. So it's been really, it's a really valuable, useful skill that I didn't necessarily expect would also still apply so heavily to this part of my career.
Knowing all that you know, what is your working definition of good sex?
Oh, it's sex that to you feels like fun and liberating. Good is so subjective just in general. Like what's good food, what's good ice cream, what's a good show, right? But good sex is the kind of sex that you genuinely want and you had fun. And and fun, like even if you didn't have an orgasm, even if you didn't necessarily do the choreography that you had planned out earlier, even if you had that stomach ache that never went away, you had it on your terms, and whoever you were having that sex with, if anybody else, also had a good time. And if everyone had a good time, then like fuck yeah, that's good sex.
I love that. What are some things that you've come across doing this that are kind of well known misconceptions or really prevalent, untrue sex facts? I put facts in quotations that
Mhm.
could actually be harmful.
Oh my God. I mean, genuinely, we could do an entire podcast series about this. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the made up assumption that everybody has sex,
Mm.
and that sex is a natural thing that is like just built into us, and it's some sort of instinctual ability that we just develop over time. And once we hit puberty, it's some sort of like natural understanding. That like if you are, I don't know, healthy, it just comes naturally. You want to have sex. You know exactly what to do with your body and other people's bodies. It feels good every time. You have the same kind of outcome every time. But sex is not natural, it's a learned behavior.
Mm.
We don't know what the fuck we're doing with anything. We're genuinely very much driven less by the presumption of procreation, which can only happen from a penis going into a vagina, which is like one of a million kinds of sex. And how boring if that's all the sex you ever think exists in the world. We're driven by the pleasure, and pleasure, it has been a sexualized concept, but pleasure itself is a human drive. If it feels good, sounds good, gives us a good feeling, we want to do a whole lot of it. Which is why if when we're kids, if nobody is looking after us or making sure we're doing what we need to be doing, we would be eating Skittles with chocolate milk for every meal, potentially mixed together in a bowl, like that's fucking delicious. We would be watching the things that make us have a good time. We would be playing outside, digging in the dirt, finding bugs all day. And, we're driven by pleasure. And so to think that sex is the only way to experience that, also very boring and not true. And so we're driven to feel nice and to seek things that make us feel nice in our bodies and in our minds. Sex with ourselves or other people is just one of a million ways that people can do that. And there are a lot of people for whom they're just, sex is sort of like, that's fine. But like, I like ice cream more, or I really like reading better. Or right now, I'm in the mood to do this other thing that's just not sex that will give me this sense of safety or groundedness or connection or joy that I'm seeking. There are some people for whom sex is just like the least appealing thing on the planet, and it's not because they're disordered, it's because that's just not a thing that sounds good to them. Similarly with like, for some people, seafood, nah, I don't think seafood's going to do it for me, and maybe I'll work through that one day and maybe I won't, but that's fine, because to, you know, how what I know about myself, I'm not into it. So, and then there are other people for whom, you know, sex is like just one of many things that they enjoy doing, but it's not like this the utmost most important thing that must happen like once a day in order for them to feel healthy or good or wanted or whatever it is. And however sex means to a person, every single person has to figure out how to do it if they want to. So nobody is just born knowing exactly what to do and like, oh my God, they are just the quintessential person. We need to all, you know, worship them and get them a book deal. We all have to wing it and figure it out. And so that is sort of like a key. It feels a little bit like a foundational falsehood or a lie that we are sometimes told literally, like it is natural, everybody does it, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you. But what's more common is it's a more subtle message we get from kind of the get-go, where there's this assumption that sex is a universal experience for people, everybody has it, it's natural, and the explanation is, well, it's how we survive as a human race. So that's why it's natural and we're driven to it and all this stuff. All a total made up falsehood. It's all completely made up, because the human race doesn't survive through the concept of sex. The human race, quote unquote, survives through procreation. And putting a penis in a vagina is only one way that procreation could potentially happen. But what's more likely to happen, if we really needed procreation to be a thing, like we wouldn't actually be doing it PIV manual style. We would be doing it using science and medicine, because the success rate is far better. So anyway, like that whole baseline untruth is what often confuses us from the start and helps bring a little bit of a misunderstanding about what sex can be like for people. And then if it's different for us from what that assumption is, we start to kind of, it's almost like the very first shame or confusion spiral a lot of us will go down, because we'll notice like, it doesn't seem to be showing up for me in the way that everybody says, or I assume everybody says it should. So therefore there must be something uniquely wrong with me or my partner or partners, but certainly not there must be something wrong with the actual piece of bullshit that I think is true because everyone's fed it to me and each other for, you know, eons. So I know maybe it's a very meaty one, but like that's the first thing that comes to mind as like a major falsehood misunderstanding.
Yeah, I'm glad that that's the direction that you went. And thank you for dismantling that it's this normal thing that we're kind of born to do. And if you're asexual or you don't have sex or you don't crave sex, something's wrong with you. And it's quote unquote normal. And men want to have sex more than women. And these are kinds of the things that you're right, it is kind of this programming, this societal programming of you have shame on the religious end coming into it and being like, oh, shame on you for having these feelings and wanting this, or shame on you for not wanting this, and this is what's normal. And obviously it's like pacing is at an individual level. It's individual to you and your relationships, and there is no quote unquote normalcy as far as frequency.
Definitely. I would say there's really no normal for anything related to sexuality, because it is so fucking all over the place. There genuinely is no even like quote unquote normal range, because whatever made up range we're using as a baseline was literally made up, and all of the outliers that would look like a giant cloud around it have just been deleted and called outliers, therefore statistically insignificant. But there are so many of them that they're literally the most significant statistic on the planet. But because they don't fit within this little narrow range of quote unquote normal, they just get to be erased and framed as irrelevant. And that's among the reasons why we are where we are today, where these assumptions around, you know, a lot of these concepts of like medical normal or bodily normal, really just based on a mid-range, sort of 20 to 40-year-old white European men, cisgender, not disabled, and with certain health profiles. And that becomes like the range of normal that everybody applies to. It's really similar in the sexuality field. It's a similarly narrow baseline of normal that everyone thinks that they should be fitting within. And they don't even realize that most of us are floating in the fun area outside of this made up little range.
Yeah, absolutely. Even a program as well intentioned as 12 step, I know from the sex and love addiction group that if
Mhm.
you just don't have sex and don't engage in relationships, they call it love anorexia. And I'm like, well, that's kind of, it feels like an insulting term for someone who's maybe just physically uninterested.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's again the whole other podcast series, like getting me started on abstinence based quote unquote support that shows up in the 12 step world, that is a total parallel to the failure abstinence based war on drugs dare campaigns, and the abstinence based don't have sex, abstinence is the only way. It's all in that same sort of purity culture umbrella that doesn't actually represent how humans exist and ends up being really harmful because people are just sort of like, okay, I'll follow these rules. And you tell me that by following these rules, I'm going to be sober in recovery. I'm going to be potentially resolved in my trauma. Potentially, I'll have all these healthy relationships I've always wanted and people tell me I should have. So I'll just follow all your rules to a T, which end up being really restrictive and kind of impossible to follow. And then if you don't follow them, or if you quote unquote fail, it's because you didn't follow them well enough. It's really similar to cult mentality. It's
Mm-hmm.
really similar to diet culture. It's really similar to wellness culture, where it's like, well, I gave you the protocol. So if it's not working for you, it's because you did something wrong. The protocol is good though. Give me another $25 a month. You know what I mean? Like, it's all in a very similar type of umbrella that's setting us up for so much failure. And among the reasons why, I mean, my perspective comes from, among other things, I spent many years teaching and working, running groups in rehabs and early recovery for teenagers, for adults, young adults, older adults, and having to do a lot of dismantling in some of these groups around these assumptions people have about how they should and shouldn't be feeling or behaving related to their bodies or sex or a desire to be close to someone else. And there's so much shame and guilt because there's so much failure
Mm-hmm.
because the rules are too difficult to follow. They're like kind of built to be a little bit, impossible. So you're always striving. And at the end of the day, you start looking around and you're just like, oh my God, I think I'm kind of miserable. Wait a minute, how did I get here? If I was supposed to feel so amazing now that I've made all these changes, like what's wrong with me? And there's not a lot of space to be able to just think about like, well, maybe there's something wrong with the container I'm trying to fit myself in, or maybe there's something wrong with the information I'm getting. Maybe that's something I should look at. I could talk forever about that kind of stuff, so bear with me.
I love that. What would you say, or is there a most common issue that people come to you with, and how do you walk them through it?
Mm. Yeah, at this point, it's funny. There have been so many that I don't know if I would say there's like a most common, but I will say, thinking about in the past, definitely concerns around orgasm and whether or not they're having good enough ones, or whether or not they're having any and not really being sure, or this idea that there's always room to like improve, or to get better and better, or to kind of like gamify it somehow, to find a way to make some other kind of eruption happen. And if once they're able to do that, they've biohacked their sex life. There's definitely been people coming to me with those kinds of thoughts and concerns. Um, but definitely, maybe a common theme would be like they're pretty sure that they could be having better sex. They're pretty sure that their sex is like it's fine, but they're pretty sure it could probably be incredible. So like, what can I do to get to the incredible part? And it's really all based on these made up ideas about like what sex is supposed to be like, mixed in with just kind of American culture around like never settle, or like don't be stagnant, always be like striving and improving and blah 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 blah. And it like keeps us completely out of the pleasure and fun and joy aspect, and it just becomes work.
Of course. Can you biohack an orgasm?
I mean, biohack to me, that phrasing at this point has so much like tech bro baggage that my immediate reaction is just like, no, gross, get the fuck out of here with that, you know. There's orgasm is an experience that is presumed to be like a relatively standardized experience. And what we know and learn about orgasm, not simply from like brain imaging, which completely takes the human out of it, but like having conversations and having qualitative research, like survey based type conversational research about orgasm experiences, we learn that they really are all over the place in terms of how people might describe them, whether or not they happen in a consistent way, whether or not they happen as a result of the same kind of stimulus. There's this thought that like orgasm is a universal thing and it always happens from like genitals being diddled with in some way. And there's an assumption that the orgasm itself like happens in the genital, when in reality orgasm actually happens in the brain. It is a brain
Mm.
experience. Our brain and our nervous system, like if anyone's ever seen Body Worlds exhibits where they take the whole nervous system and they use whatever interesting water thing they do to like get all the goo and the meat and stuff out of, you know, in between all of those nerve fibers, and you just see the nervous system. Like if I was standing here, I'm like mimicking it. It looks like a person standing, except it's just nerves and then a spine and a creepy brain eyeball situation up in here. So we are covered in, like, our brain isn't just here, it's connected throughout our whole body. And so orgasm can happen, medium tangent, from any kind of stimulation. It depends on the person, and you don't have to do anything to your genitals. You don't even have to have genitals to have an orgasm experience, because it's very much a brain nervous system nerves experience and not something that's just like localized. And so this idea of like biohacking, there's definitely an industry behind it. There are a lot of tech broy type people, not all bros though, but they're in the culture, creating products that are meant to somehow, you know, stimulate you here using electrostimulation, or here's this thing that will measure all of your muscle contractions so that you can like track and improve the next time. But really at the end of the day, like if orgasm is a goal for you or you're having trouble with it, the first thing to think about is just how connected am I with my brain and my body? Like, how much of a connection is there, and how much is there a potential severance or disconnection? Because to exist in our world, we kind of have to be disconnected, at least for part of the day, to just be able to deal and exist and
Mm-hmm.
do our jobs. And so there is no amount of like supplements or workouts or whatever that can then just somehow like refuse that connection. And as annoying as it is, a lot of it has to do with seeing what it's like to be still a little bit and to be a little bit quiet, and then just kind of see like what am I able to even feel in my body without anything happening. Like if I lie here, what do I feel? Where's the pressure? What's the temperature? Where are the tingles? Where's the numbness? If I touch my leg, like what does it feel like? Can I notice it and fully feel what's happening? And that is a far more effective quote unquote biohack than a lot of the stuff that ends up being viral on TikTok, you know, or lucrative for a company to sell.
Absolutely. That's such a huge takeaway, that the orgasm is so much more about the brain and the nervous system, because that's like a recurring theme on this podcast as I talk about the nervous system, but I've never made that connection or had anyone make that connection before. That's incredibly fascinating.
Cool. It's
Yeah.
so cool. Yeah, our brains are so cool. They're
They,
very annoying and can be very inconvenient, but at the end of the day, once you start to realize like you're doing your best, look at all this shit you're doing for me right now. Oh my god, how cool. Maybe I'm going to be a little bit less of a dick to you and like a little bit less critical and just think like, okay, wow, look what you're capable of. Like, how do I maybe reframe my relationship to my brain so that it doesn't feel so much like, for a lot of us at least, you know, a me versus my brain kind of a battle. And instead it's like, yeah, what would it be like to kind of collaborate a little bit more? because especially with the orgasm pleasure thing, like without our brains, we wouldn't have any pleasure. Ice cream, eating, petting a cat, making out, all of that pleasure wouldn't be possible without our brains.
I love that. Can we talk about how sexuality changes as we age and how, particularly for women with hormonal changes, how can sex still be enjoyable, or what kinds of ways can we reframe it mentally so that when we're not in like an ideal situation and the mood isn't 100%, or maybe you're not like physically feeling 100%, like how can you still make it an enjoyable experience?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is just to think about like, well, when you think of sex, like what is the behavior that you're actually describing? Because it really can be different for people. For a lot of people, sex is like a penis going into a vagina and like bing, bada bing, that's kind of it. And if that's the thing that's sounding kind of like meh, then like good to know. Thank God there's a million other ways to also have sex. And so there is nothing you can do to make sex that feels unappealing to you in your body feel appealing. Like
Mm.
there is no pill, there is no exercise, there is no product that can like force your way into finding unappealing sex appealing. It's not a convenient truth for a lot of people who would rather just figure out like I just need to get it over with because it's easier to try to find a way to make unappealing sex feel appealing than have to deal with the partner or partners involved in the sex that doesn't feel appealing anymore, because we're not equipped to have those conversations. And especially if it involves a heterosexual man, it can be risky actually to have those kinds of conversations emotionally, mentally, sometimes physically, unfortunately. All that said, getting clear on what sex, the sex that feels kind of blah, and just knowing what that is good to know, because then that gets to be put onto the side. We're not going to try to have that sex right now because what's the fucking point? It's not
Mhm.
fun. It doesn't feel good. And then we get to think about, well, what does sound fun? Outside of maybe my definitions of what should count as sex, but like what potentially gives a little bit of a tingle or a light up sensation in my body when I think about it. Anything from a neck kiss to a foot rub to like ordering someone around to eating some food while somebody touches your butt. Like it genuinely get creative. And as soon as you start to feel judgy or a little bit embarrassed about yourself, that's where you take a pause and you get to say something out loud like, fuck that, that's someone else policing my pleasure, go away, you're not welcome. And then you keep thinking about, yeah, what's the stuff that sounds fun, even if it doesn't feel like it technically counts as sex. And get the orgasm goal. It does not have to be present either, because for some people an additional definition of sex is like, well, if an orgasm happens then it was sex, no matter how it happened. If it happened, great. Also a total made up standard that like is unfair to you and your body and potentially your partners too. So moving that aside, you just focus on, yeah, like what feels fun and good and accessible to me. And it's possible that in that moment, like nothing will. And then you get to pause and you think, okay, well, I'm going to talk to my partner or my partners and see like what sounds fun to you. And then hearing what they say sounds fun, you do it a second run and you kind of think about like what's lighting my body up, what has a tingle or a little bit of a lift or a oh curiosity type reaction when I hear them talk about what sounds fun. And then you get to see, okay, yeah, that might be something to try. Cool. So it's not always up to you, but you get to be the start of the process. You definitely get to start thinking about like what sounds good. And if the partner or partners that you're with aren't receptive to that kind of conversation that is valuable information about their value as a partner to you as a human, not value like high value manosphere bullshit, but genuinely like, is this a safe partner for you and your body? Is this a safe partner if you're not able to talk about what sounds fun? I want to have sex, and I want to have sex that sounds really good. So let's figure out what is that? Like what sounds really good? If they can't have that conversation with you, that is information around just considering, do we need support here, like someone to help facilitate this conversation so that we can get a little bit more used to it? Is there some sort of coaching or support that my partner might need? and that I might need separate in order to be able to kind of like build the tools or the confidence to be able to have the conversation? Are there books to read? Is there TV to watch together? Is there maybe the sex conversation's too intense? So we need to first start having conversations about what feels good and sounds nice to do that isn't in a sexual context, and have that be like kind of the starting conversation, a lower stakes conversation, like maybe food to try. And then once you start to kind of build the familiarity with that kind of conversation, then you can bring in the sexual context to see how that feels, and kind of just like take it slow. So it's not in all or nothing. Like if the conversation doesn't go well, it's not like your partner is trash, get rid of them. I'm sure that happens. There are plenty of trash partners, but if it doesn't go well the first time, it just means, oh, I'm learning to ride a bike, and of course I fell over. Of course they fell over. We have no idea how to balance on this thing, so you just have to give yourselves time and patience. But that is the most effective way, in my professional opinion, as well as personal, as you are shifting and changing, getting a little bit more clear on like what kind of sex you want to have and what feels good, and how to kind of actually get into a place of desire and arousal, not forcing yourself into that place.
Yeah, you inadvertently answered my next question within that question about, as we evolve, as our age changes and our bodily desires may not be what they used to be. That also kind of sums up how to handle, this cliche of faking an orgasm and feeling like you need to validate your partner by having one, and then being afraid to hold space for that conversation and be like, hey, it didn't actually happen for me. Here's how we have it. And then being able to approach that conversation maybe a second time, or starting at kind of that lower stakes place of making it about something other than sex, and just making sure that you're with someone who is willing to hold space for what works for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we are not taught this. Definitely, anyone socialized as a woman to consider sex as like an equitable participatory playtime where everyone involved gets to have a good time, and instead it's often like the woman or the femme, and this is very much in a like a heteronormative type of context. Men need it, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote. It's like air and food and water. No, it's not. It's total fucking lie and scam. That's super violent and creepy, but men need it, so therefore you gotta give it. You can't starve your partner. Don't be, how awful of you. And so whether that's been literally told to us, and then a lot of us have had that drilled down, or it was a more subtle impression given to us over time, there is this thought that, well, sex isn't really for me, so I'll just kind of like go along with it, and if it's fine, great. Like if it's fine, it's fine for me. And there isn't necessarily that same kind of idea around like, oh, this also gets to be really enjoyable for me as well, and if something doesn't sound good to me, I don't actually have to do that. Like it is not my job to do something that it feels not good to me, or maybe even like awful or uncomfortable, just because this other person wants it from me or feels entitled to access me to have that experience. And it's definitely, there's like deprogramming involved to kind of get out of that mindset. But what a wondrous idea to be able to really go into sex being like, this is supposed to be good for everybody here, so like let's see what sounds good for everybody here, instead of like, here's what we're gonna do, or nobody says anything and you just start acting and doing shit until you're like, wait a minute, what the get out of there, what are you doing, and so, and then we start having all these really horrible, uncomfortable, and sometimes traumatic experiences that are very much stored in our minds forever, and very much like are in our bodies, whether we know it or not, for almost ever. And so like that follows us to every other relationship that we're in. The orgasm faking conversation, I know that it's a hot topic still. A lot of people like to talk about it. And to me, it's really just, if it's a safety tool, or if it's a tool that is needed in that moment, like, okay, but at the end of the day, who is it helping?
Right.
And is it helping, and how much? And then how much is it also not helping as well? Just so that you can, without judging it necessarily, but just kind of like check in with yourself around, what do I gain and not gain from doing this if I'm doing it regularly? And what would it be like to do something different? And different doesn't mean the opposite. Different just means anything else but the thing you usually do, to see how it feels or how it lands. So you'll never hear me say it's all bad or it's all good, right? Because I always live in the gray. But it is something that can be quicksand and it can be a trap over time.
Absolutely. I mean, especially in the context of maybe like a more serious or long-term partnership, if you're going to continue to do that, it's just going to get harder and harder to have the conversation later down
Yeah.
the line. But speaking of scams, I thought this was so fascinating. Back during our pre-interview, you mentioned love languages and how you look at those, and I would love for you to expand on that.
Oh, well, I literally wrote a book about it. So I'll plug it. Speaking from the Heart: 18 Languages for Modern Love. The concepts of love languages, as we know it, is based off of a book written in 1992 by an evangelical Christian minister. And the book called is The Five Love Languages. People are very familiar with that, tend to be. And it was a bit of a sleeper, wasn't necessarily a big book until around, I want to say like the almost 2008, 2012, that kind of time, where Instagram, was Facebook very much existed, but like Instagram started happening. Twitter was very much like Twitter was what Twitter was. And it started to get picked up as like relationship advice, when really it was very much like how to keep a Christian marriage together type of a book.
Mm.
But then it started to like get some attention outside of the overtly, Christian or evangelical world. And so the guy who wrote it started to get marketed as a marriage counselor to build trust among secular people, and for people to be like, oh my God, yeah. When really he's an evangelical minister who just talks to a lot of heterosexual couples, married couples in his parish, who were trying to figure out how to stay married because they didn't really have any other choice. And so he would counsel them through the Bible and evangelical teachings, which is very harmful, purity culture through and through. And so the five love languages that this guy had originally written are all through an evangelical lens of purity culture that, among other things, sexualizes love in ways that perpetuates rape culture, confuses the fuck out of everybody because it starts to make it feel a little confusing around, well, how do I navigate things like love and relationships? Not just the sex part, but like, how do I navigate it? And what happens when like sex and love become kind of the same thing? Because that must mean it just creates a whole new pressure around sex, that on top of the pressure that was already there about sex. And so anyway, one of the biggest scams of it is it's not based on any kind of like science or even real like subjective or qualitative research. It's this guy who was married for a while, noticed when he helped, and he's in the I know this because he divulged this in the 30th anniversary article that he was interviewed for in the New York Times a couple years ago. He noticed that when he helped his wife around the house, she seemed to feel less irritated.
Well, no
He seemed
shit.
to be pleased. Oh my God, what a fucking, oh my God, make him president. Like, what a genius. Um, and so he was like, acts of service? And then, like, physical touch very much was a sexualized concept. It wasn't simply just physical touch equals sex, therefore you have to have sex with me, but it's all in the similar umbrella around like affectionate touch can then be the thing that like leads to sex. So it also sexualizes touch in unhelpful ways, so that any kind of hug is a potential lead up to sex and not just like, I want to connect with you for a moment. Which then also makes it weird because you hug your fucking family and you hug your kids and you hug your coworkers sometimes. So like, very confusing. But what isn't confusing about evangelicalism, among other things? And so like the five he came up with were really just, he made them up based off of his own individual experience, and then like what he noticed all of his married couples trying not to get a divorce would share. And so then he creates this book all through his lens, and then it gets marketed very cleverly and sneakily and effectively as some sort of secular marriage counseling advice and not literal evangelical propaganda marketed as self-help, which in the year 2025, a majority of the self-help book category and podcast category and CDs is dominated by evangelicalism. And it's a whole industry that makes a lot of money for the church in that way. So scam wise, it can be the concept of thinking about ways of expressing and identifying love as like a world language. I love that. Best analogy ever. And leave it at that. It's not scientific, it's not a brain thing. Any research that's happened since has not been able to support any of his ideas. So it's not even like provable. And it's so subjective for people that there are a lot of folks who try to like make the five love languages make sense to them and they can't. And so throw back to our earlier part of the conversation, they think, well, there must be something wrong with me,
Mm-hmm.
and not potentially the idea of taking something like love and trying to make five neat and tidy separate categories out of it. Have you humaned before? Like, how on earth does anyone logically think that's fucking possible, let alone something that could then be supported by any kind of like science or research? So that's like the gist of the scam of the five love languages. And if we can try to just like reframe it as potentially an idea we can use to help us out, great. But like, we do not have to keep buying that book. We do not have to keep recommending it. And we do have to know and make sure people know that it is, at the end of the day, it is evangelical teachings that is being marketed in a manipulative way to make the rest of us think it's good and useful. And it's helping to infiltrate our entire culture to bring purity culture into the norm.
Yeah, that makes sense because there is kind of this pressure that goes along with it where if your partner says, oh, well, touch is my love language. So if you're not obliging me with that, then you are
Mm-hmm.
not considering my love language. And then it turns, it can be spun as a form of neglect by the partner.
Yes, and abuse. It happens a lot actually, where my wife is abusing me and starving me by saying no when I come to her saying, "Please have sex with me the way I want because it sounds good to me and you are my sex doll." Like, they're not literally saying that, but that's what they're saying. And if you say no, you are abusing me and starving me and we need to go to therapy so that you can figure your shit out. It's like, holy God, how do we undo this? And I've had some couples working with me where I learn over time that that is what's happening in their sex life. And it's like, oh shit, this is a him problem to start. And I don't think he's going to want to know that. I don't think he's going to like that. And let's see what happens here. And it can be it's really hard to undo because it's also very much mixed up in gender roles and these made up ideas about men need sex, women don't need it, but they like it as long as you cuddle after, all
Mm-hmm.
of that kind of bullshit. And it's really hard to undo that when it's for some people like the air they breathe.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you wrote a book that was undoing that and deconstructing it, do you have a version of love languages that is more accurate or a way for people to express what their needs are without it crossing a line into abuse or into just like unreasonable expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I call them modern love languages, and I wouldn't necessarily say they're more accurate because at the end of the day, like, what does it even mean anymore? I would say they're more reflective of the human experience because I have identified, and it was through the 7-ish years spent really just working with all kinds of people, including people in early recovery, where I got to really see how what love really meant to people and when it didn't, and how it got mixed up with the sex stuff and how it would get complicated, and what were some of the common themes and common misunderstandings and common like sadnesses and wants when it comes to things like love. And through that, I just kind of identified 18 ways to express love, but also ways to recognize it. So it's not just an action you're doing outward. It's also like, how do I actually know, not intellectualizing it, but like, how do I know what love feels like to me? Like, if you give me a gift, maybe in my head, I'm like, this should make me feel loved because this cost a lot of money, or you thought you were very thoughtful. But if it doesn't actually give you the feeling of feeling loved, which might be to you feeling respected, Or to that other person, it might be feeling safe. That other person, it might be tingles in their toes. Like, what is it actually to you? Like, what does it mean or feel like to feel loved? And so the next time someone does something for you or to you or gives you something, you get to be like, well, regardless of what makes sense logically to me, am I getting any of those signals that tell me I'm feeling really loved right now? If I am, this is useful info because this thing this person did or said, I'm probably going to want that to happen again. Or that's good for me to know it during times where I'm like, no one loves me or I'm always alone. You're like, wait a minute. I know what gives me that feeling. I'm going to do that for myself right now. So it also gets to be very empowered and not just like you're always dependent on someone else to do it or to like access it. But it's also like ways to better understand, when I want to show someone that I love them or I'm showing them affection or respect or whatever, instead of like doing the thing that makes sense to me or that I should be doing because that's what love means, I instead think, well, what is something that if I was to do it or say it or whatever would give me the body sensation or the emotion sensation of loving, not simply just feeling loved. And then I'm going to do that instead of going down the list of the should love behaviors. And instead it's like, yeah, I feel so much love towards someone when, I don't know, I find a way to find the weird, obscure candy bar that they don't sell at Trader Joe's anymore. And I found a box of them. Fuck yeah. Technically, that's giving a gift,
Mm-hmm.
but it had nothing to do with price tags or a brand name or whether it was like, going viral online. It's like, oh, this gave me the sensation of feeling love outwardly. And that is the reason I'm doing it. Like, I'm doing it because I know this actually has the feeling behind it. And it has that feeling behind it because I know so much about the person I'm doing it for. And I know the thing that I'm doing, like I know the impact of the thing I'm about to do. And there's so much more to it than just this like surface level, checking a box and like, well, why aren't you feeling loved? I did all the things. I followed the quiz and I did whatever. I read, did all the instructions and I followed the script. So there's 18 in the book and there are examples. I use little pictures just to show like here's what it could look like and here's not what it looks like in case it gets confusing. Like these are not what I'm talking about. So there's also examples of those, but it doesn't mean that there's only 18 either. Part of what's in the book is really just letting people know that like there's 18 here, which is already feels like a lot because there's like 7-ish years of drilling down information from people. But that means like there could be another edition of this book in a couple of years where there's like 40.
Mm-hmm.
Or people, they can email me. I tell them to do this. If you notice something that feels like it's potentially its own modern love language, email me and I'll add it in the future. And I'll obviously credit you. This is such a subjective human experience. There is no way that the hundreds of people I worked with plus me were enough to figure out, quote unquote, all of the modern love languages. There's just so many ways that love can show up. And so maybe accurate's not the word, but I would say like representative of the vastness of the human experience of love because it is really so vast and subjective.
Yeah, it's true. And that'll take into account people in entirely different cultures and the things that they're brought up with and what might mean love or, because sometimes something as simple as maybe one culture in a boardroom meeting shakes hands and another bows, and both within that particular culture are what matters to them and what's important to them. And it should be the same with love and relationships and how we vary between upbringings and ages and groups and just like everything that makes people like on this beautiful expansive spectrum of what they're interested in and what works for them. So I really
Mm-hmm.
love that. I'm curious, what is this concept of relationship anarchy and how does that come into play for people?
Yeah, so I'm not going to give like a, kind of textbook definition, but it is certainly the idea of what would it be like to have relationships that without the weird scripting and the scaffolding and the rules and the structures that we sometimes knowingly and other times don't have around these concepts of relationships. Like, what would it be like to have relationships that are completely purely on our terms? So for some people, relationship anarchy is eliminating any concept, even like the essence of monogamy or ownership type culture or patriarchal type hierarchy around like whose needs are most important and whose needs are not, and who decides what those needs are, like throwing them all in the garbage and really thinking about, yeah, I have the relationships that I have in my life, especially the sexual ones, but not just the sexual ones, are completely on my terms. And I make sure everybody that I am with, sexually or otherwise, knows what those terms are so that they can tell for themselves, does this work for me? Is this aligned with my terms as well? And if so, fuck yeah. And a big part of relationship anarchy, as well as any type of non monogamy, is really consistent, sometimes constant communicating of those terms and potentially negotiating and renegotiating some of the terms so that everybody involved feels in their mind and their body that they are not compromising on something that is core to them in order to accommodate someone else. And that's just one way of thinking about it. So I am definitely not like the number one go-to expert about this. But what's been kind of fun with the modern love language work is it very much is a useful, valuable tool in a lot of non-monogamy and relationship anarchy type structures, because it's really taking the sexualization, the romanticization, the social scripts, the social norms that exist on all of these ideas of like what counts as a relationship and what's healthy and what should you want and like what the should the dynamic look like, and just throwing it all in the trash and setting it on fire and just really thinking like, yeah, all of that was made up to benefit someone or a group of people a long time ago, and that's fucking, and I'm not one of them clearly, so like fuck that. What can we do instead? What could we have instead? And so for many people, it's a political statement for them. It's a way that they want to show up in the world. And then it's also liberating for a lot of people to really be able to like have the skill and ability to identify and recognize when they're participating in a system that's like totally not in their best interest and was created by some, oppressive, probably piece of shit to benefit him and his cronies. So like, hell yeah, I'm so glad I can do this. And I'm so glad I'm seeking out people to be friends with and community with, potentially in bed with, potentially not, who feel very similarly. And like we can build our relationship structures based on that mutual understanding that the number one thing we want to prioritize here is everybody's joy and freedom and safety, and deprioritize to the point of like it doesn't even come to people's minds any of the attitudes and expectations and norms that have been just imposed and shoved down people's throats for so long. It can feel really, for some people, like feeling safe and potentially accessing things like joy or pleasure or orgasm becomes more possible because those um, confining, restrictive type norms and rules don't have their clutches in anymore. And so they can actually breathe and exist. Their nervous systems can potentially find a place of like soothing where it's actually like physically and physiologically possible to feel something nice in your body, because your brain is like, all right, we're good here. We're good here. This is great. I like this. Let's, yeah, touch my feet, or whatever the thing is. So yeah, I encourage people, yeah, do a little bit of Googling and see what comes up around relationship anarchy. Maybe something will pique your interest.
It's a brand new term to me, so I really love learning about it. And I think it kind of comes back to this almost recurring theme of finding a way to be embodied and figuring out what is correct for your nervous system. And maybe that is something completely outside of the norms that have been drilled into us. Or maybe it's within those. And it's just a matter of like what actually authentically creates the least friction and brings the most joy and pleasure, and what is that, and don't be afraid to explore that if it is outside of the parameters that we've all grown up with.
Yeah, totally. Easier said than done, right? But it
Yeah.
is definitely a part of the healing process. It doesn't necessarily have to be as potentially extreme sounding as like throwing all of your relationship norms out the window, but it might be for some. For others, it might be as simple as like, you know what? I don't have to eat. I don't have to wait for dessert. I'm going to have dessert at 4 and then I'll eat dinner whenever I'm hungry. And like, this is a little low stakes change from a routine that I'm only following because it was how everything has always been. But if like my body is just like, let's do the ice cream sandwich, let's do it. I want it. And you're like, okay, let's do it. It's almost like thinking about, by no means am I going in the clinical side of things, but like, a little bit of reparenting around listening to the signals or the wants or the desires, and instead of immediately like, authority figure like, no, it's against the rules, or like, no, broccoli first, or literally or figuratively eat the broccoli first. What would it be like to be like, actually, let's do a little different? And like, what does that even feel like to kind of break that little rule? And that might be the, opening the door just enough to start to really meet yourself where you're at, truly. And I do think that for people who are able to start to recognize the rules that they are following, sometimes without even realizing it, with such a punitive, authoritative, like policey type of vibe, as soon as they notice it and start to try to do things a little different, I suspect that a majority of people will notice really happy side effects of that. And it might even just be like you sleep a little bit easier, or your dreams are a little bit less stressful. It might be as impactful as like you feel more glimmers of joy throughout your day. Like there's more space for those glimmers to exist. And then, they might go away kind of soon, but like they can exist. Whereas before it was really hard for them to show up at all. It can be a really powerful healing process.
Yeah, remarkable. So this is a bit of a out of left field compared to what we've been talking to, but I do think it's important to cover this. Can you share with me what a patient seeing a gynecologist should actually be anticipating, and where some of the discomfort comes from, and how a patient can really like take control of that situation and make sure that it doesn't become this uncomfortable thing that then leads to avoiding dealing with our reproductive health? Because I know a lot of people avoid going because it is overwhelmingly an uncomfortable experience.
Totally. I mean, all of this is easier said than done, first off, of course, like with a lot of things, but especially, healthcare isn't always all that available. And for some people, their closest gyno is like an hour or more drive away. So we might not have the ability to choose a provider who will treat us like a human. So the first thing is being prepared to encounter a variety of kinds of attitudes from the provider, and you don't have to like accept or be okay with their behavior, but to be prepared for it. It is possible you might not be treated with respect by this person who is literally about to go inside of your body, and it shouldn't be that way, but that may happen. So the thing to focus on, if possible, if there are things you can do before you go to a doctor's appointment that make you feel like a fucking badass bitch owning your whole world, do those things. If that means, I mean, I don't know, eating something, doing little power poses, listening to your favorite song, stomping around, making a lot of noise, uh, anything, do that, and really kind of get grounded in the fact that no matter what you encounter by this provider, you are a full human deserving of respect. And if they don't give that to you, that's a them problem. That is on them. It is not on you. The next thing is being clear on what you're going to the doctor for, so that you can potentially do a little bit of Googling ahead of time just to kind of be prepared around like, what would this entail? So typically like a pelvic exam, which usually is the thing you do with the gyno, sometimes once a year, depending on the state you live in, you might do it actually every 3 years or longer. Some newer rules around pap smear frequency have just come out in the last year, where you don't actually need it as often as we were told. So then you get to kind of realize, okay, to do this exam, this provider will have to go into my vagina, and my vagina will need to get sort of spread open a little bit so that they can go and see my cervix at the end of my vagina, or the other side of my vagina, and then be able to take a swab and touch it with a little bit of a scratchy tool. And so in order to do that, there is going to be like entry into the vagina, which can be like weird feeling for some people. And it does mean that the tool that is going to help that person do that pap smear, it's going to have to sort of spread and stretch the muscles of the walls of the vagina, which can also feel weird. And so if we can kind of be prepared ahead of time about what the procedure might look like, And sometimes we can find out a little bit of subjective descriptions around what it might feel like. It helps us prepare a little bit. And some providers who have gone through really appropriate training, they will actually walk you through the whole process. And so even though you've done your research ahead of time, they might actually step by step tell you what's about to happen, which is so amazing. And maybe something that you encounter. And it also might not be. I've encountered the gamut of shitty and also really lovely behavior and treatment at this point. So there's that. Another thing is if there are certain questions that you want to ask, certain pieces of information that you would like to know what that is ahead of time and potentially write down what the question is and maybe even like kind of script it for yourself and practice like what is it like to say this out loud. And if you have a friend or someone that you trust, have a practice conversation beforehand. Even if you're laughing the whole time, it doesn't matter. It helps your nervous system get familiar with the question, and it helps your nervous system get used to what does it feel like to say the words out loud. So that's really important and helpful. It is sometimes helpful to script responses to potential reactions from the provider that you might be like, what did you just say?
Mm.
You might get thrown off. I've had this
Yeah.
happen where I'm like, how on earth is that your answer to the thing I've just said? What do I even say? And like sometimes we freeze. And so if you have a question about an STI because you had, 5 more partners than usual, or you had 500 partners this year, and you're like, I feel like I should probably get a different kind of screening. What do you want to be prepared to say back to someone if they make a judgy reaction? And one of the most effective ones I like to just say is, um, I don't really understand that reaction. Can you explain?
Mm.
Or that feels like a really unhelpful, judgmental way to reply to an important health question I have. So it's a really similar kind of neutral reaction to if someone makes a racist or sexist joke and you're just like, that's a strange thing to say to a stranger. Or I don't get it. Will you walk me through? Really similar kind of a vibe. And those can be things to practice beforehand so you can see what is it like to not hook in and just really observe a fucked up behavior and like name it without going into the territory of like, difficult patient or whatever. You might get labeled that regardless, but it's no one can accuse you of being an asshole by saying that feels like a really judgmental way to reply to a health question, you know?
Mhm.
Another thing too is, what was the other one? The and if you have a request for a test or a question or something that you want them to do or provide to you, and if they argue with you or tell you no or decline for whatever reason, another really effective thing to practice is to say, okay, will you please put it in my chart that you have declined my request for this test?
Oh.
Please put this in my chart that you declined to answer this question. I need to make sure it's in the paperwork. This will get you attitude if you haven't gotten attitude already. But
Mhm.
again, this takes some time to kind of like build a muscle for. But if a provider gives you attitude for you genuinely doing the bare minimum self advocacy, that's information that they're a shitty provider and you might be stuck with them regardless. So this is, we don't have the convenience necessarily of like finding a new one. And the new one might also be shitty too, but they might not, but still. If you can be prepared for like be able to sit with shitty provider behavior and not internalize it or personalize it as like your fault or that you've done something wrong, and potentially be prepared to get looks by the receptionist or to be maybe labeled as a difficult patient, and to be able to be like, these are all labels being put on me because self advocacy is not acceptable. It is not the norm. Being treated as a full autonomous human is not actually the norm in these kinds of systems. And so I am behaving weird to them. I am being weird to them. So it makes sense that they would then label me this way. And that's not to excuse the behavior, but it's to help your nervous system like really understand like what's really going on here versus all of the stories or the meanings that kind of start to pop into our heads to explain why this is happening. And so those are all things that I recommend for folks who are preparing to go to the gyno. I know it feels like a lot of my recommendations are like being prepared for something awful or uncomfortable or sad or upsetting. That doesn't mean that that's a guarantee that that's what's going to happen. Like you might actually be pleasantly surprised, which is amazing. But knowing, especially for anybody who is not cisgender and even not heterosexual, um, going to a provider, that it is a higher likelihood that you might have some kind of an unhappy experience there, even if they just make a judgment about you, than you having a 100% wonderful experience. And so I want people to just be as prepared as they possibly can and to feel empowered to really not have to like behave in the expected way or to be placating or to kind of want to be like the good patient and compliant. If there is something that really doesn't feel right, or feels like that feels like a weird thing to say, or I feel like they wrote something weird down in my chart, like you really do get to say something, and it doesn't always have to be in an antagonizing way. You really get to just see, I want to better understand what's happening, or can you help me understand like what's, knowing that my chart is going to follow me to other providers, can you help me understand what is being written in the notes? Because I will look at them later. I have access to them. But can you help me understand now what's going in the charts so that I can make sure that what I am saying or what I'm asking for is really fully being represented? Because these charts, when they follow you, whatever is in those charts, it can impact the future of your care long term. So yeah, is there anything that like stood out or wasn't necessarily clear that you might like have other thoughts or questions on? Because I know I gave like a lot of streamlined or like rapid fire suggestions.
I think a lot of what you said is applicable beyond the gynecologist's office. And as you were saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that people should be anticipating a terrible experience, but it's just kind of one of those, like those responses that you gave. Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So I think that's important to keep that in mind, that it doesn't mean you're going to have a terrible experience. But if you do, particularly the part, and I've heard people that work in the medical space say this too, but I think it really needs to be repeated because people don't necessarily do it, that when you do ask for a test or you do ask for like a certain recommendation, what have you, you ask for something and it's not delivered to you, how critical it is that you ask them to make a note of that so that there's a paper trail. Because I think that's something that, you know, I've heard a lot and I've not necessarily used it. And it's really important for people to just remember that that tool is at your disposal. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to navigate all this stuff, but it's there can be community. You can find community even having these kinds of conversations where you're just like, oh my God, I'm so glad that I asked this question, or I'm so glad I listened to this podcast or whatever, because I never would have even thought that this could actually be a tool I could use. And maybe this is the thing that will get me to, go and get my, anus swabbed because I haven't been tested for HPV back there. And like, I'm so glad that now I feel a little bit less worried to go to the gyno to do it, because sometimes like the worry and the anxiety that you end up experiencing because you're not going is so loud that you're
Right.
just like, oh my God, the anxiety of going is also bad, but it's like 10 decibels lower at this point because now I'm freaking out and I think I have all of the, all the ass illnesses that you could possibly have. And so it's like, fine, I'm choosing that anxiety instead. And sometimes like these kinds of recommendations, including like, it's all weird. It is weird to have swabs put in holes in your body. You don't even really get to choose, but like, that's how you find out what's going on. What a weird thing. And everyone can just like agree that it's fucking weird.
Mhm.
And then you're like, okay, yeah, this is weird. I'm going to go do the weird thing knowing now it's weird. Everyone understands it's weird. And like sometimes that's enough to like get the, I don't know, the noise level down just enough to make that appointment.
Yeah, 1,000%. To wrap it up, is there anything that you know that you wish everybody listening to this understood about
Oh,
sexuality?
yes. Gender roles are roles you can choose. They are not biological. They are not hardwired. You get to choose all of them or not choose all of them. No matter what your gender is, you don't even have to have a gender. They're all a choice. None of them are biology. And don't let anybody, especially the politicians and our president and any doctor, tell you otherwise.
Amazing. Anne Hodder-Shipp, if people want to learn more or figure out a way to work with you, where should they go?
Yeah, first place, go to annehoddership.com, and that's with 2 P's for ship. That's where you can learn about me and book a session or just find out, what my deal is. And you can find me on Instagram or TikTok to see the way I talk about different kinds of topics at the Anne Hodder.
Amazing. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I got a lot out of
Yeah.
this.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.